Season 1 of You follows Joe Goldberg, a bookstore manager in New York who becomes obsessed with aspiring writer Guinevere Beck and begins manipulating her life in the hopes of developing a relationship. As Joe fantasizes about being in a relationship with Beck, he justifies to himself all of the horrific things he's willing to do for love as necessary. Joe breaks into Beck's apartment to snoop around and learn more about her, and stalks her throughout her day to keep tabs on her. When a drunken Beck falls into the subway tracks, it's Joe that is miraculously there to save her. He even steals her phone so he can monitor conversations she has once getting a new one. The first major obstacle in Joe's way of winning Beck's heart is her on-again off-again boyfriend Benji. Due to Benji being a bit of a tool, Joe feels completely justified in attacking him and locking him up in the vault in his bookstore's basement. Eventually, Joe realizes there's no good way out of this situation and is forced to kill Benji. He covers up this act by burning Benji's body and making it appear that he has simply run off. Following Benji's murder, Joe and Beck enter into a relationship, but another obstacle presents itself. Beck's best friend Peach is suspicious of Joe and is similarly obsessed with Beck and manipulating her to bend Beck to her wants. A jealous Joe hits Peach on the head with a rock and leaves her for dead, but unfortunately for Joe, she survives the attack. Not sure that it was Joe that attacked her, but still very much suspicious, Peach invites Beck over to her family estate for a getaway, with plans to whisk Beck off to live together in Paris. Beck turns down the offer, realizing that Joe was correct about Peach's manipulative ways, and leaves the estate. Joe then kills Peach and frames it as self-inflicted due to heartbreak. With Peach now out of the picture, Joe and Beck are finally free to be together with no more distractions, and that lasts for a few months. Beck grows secretive and distant, which only further fuels Joe's jealousy and possessiveness. He begins to suspect that Beck is cheating on him with her therapist, Dr. Nicky, and even begins seeing the therapist himself using an alias. Eventually, Joe confronts Beck about her relationship with the therapist, and hurt that Joe doesn't trust her, Beck breaks up with him. 3 months later, Joe is doing his best to move on. Aside from stalking Beck, Joe has looked after Paco, the young son of his drug addict neighbor Claudia. Claudia's boyfriend is an abusive parole officer named Ron who is constantly picking fights with Claudia, Paco, and Joe. Joe then enters into a relationship with Karen, Claudia's friend, and the two help Claudia get clean. But try as he might to convince himself that Karen is right for him, Joe just can't seem to get over Beck. Similarly, Beck isn't over Joe, and so Joe breaks up with Karen and reunites with Beck, making them seemingly stronger than ever. But when a spiteful Karen tells Beck that Joe will always be pining over his other ex, Beck begins to look into Joe's previous relationship with the mysterious Candace. Beck discovers that Candace was an ex-girlfriend of Joe's that seemingly went completely off the grid following their breakup and hasn't contacted friends or family in years. Beck grows concerned that something sinister is at play with Joe and that Candace may have even been murdered. And Beck should be concerned, as Joe had previously killed a man named Elijah after discovering that Candace was having an affair with him. Mr. Mooney, the original owner of the bookstore Joe manages and a father figure that mentally abused him as a child, helped Joe cover up Elijah's death. Although Joe is able to come up with a reasonable explanation for Candace's disappearance, all of his dark secrets are revealed when Beck discovers a hidden box in Joe's apartment filled with mementos of all of his previous crimes. Beck's original phone, Peach's phone, Benji's phone, even Benji's teeth. His violent ways exposed, Joe is left with no choice but to lock Beck up in the book vault until he can figure out a way to make their relationship work again. Beck pleads for her life and release, and eventually even suggests that Joe pin all of his crimes on Dr. Nicky. Back at his apartment building, the abusive Ron beats Claudia and puts her in the hospital. Joe is forced to kill Ron to protect Paco and explains to Paco what must be done to cover up this murder. As Joe deals with all of this, Beck uses a typewriter in the book vault to write her story, detailing all of Joe's horrific crimes and attributing them to Dr. Nicky instead. When Joe finally returns, Beck is able to convince him that she loves him and understands why he did everything that he did. She manages to lure Joe into the vault and locks him inside, but her escape plan is thwarted when she discovers that the basement door is also locked and a loyal Paco refuses to help her. In the end, Joe escapes the vault and finally kills Beck. 4 months later, the book Beck wrote in the vault is now a huge success. It also leads to the arrest of a framed Dr. Nicky, inadvertently exonerating Joe. But just as it looks like Joe will be able to get away with all of his past crimes, his ex-girlfriend Candace shows up, very much alive, to confront Joe over their unfinished business. In season 2 of Me? Sorry, I can't even read my own recap script because my vision is so bad. Luckily, this video's sponsor Warby Parker has me covered. Warby Parker creates designer quality glasses with nothing but premium materials in each frame. Plus, they have so many different styles to choose from, ranging from modern and trendy to timeless and classic. Right now, I'm wearing their Langley glasses, and I love these things. And just as incredible as the look of these glasses is how easy they were to order. Warby Parker has a really intuitive virtual try-on feature so you can browse and shop all of their frame options, which includes both eyeglasses and sunglasses from the comfort of your home. But if you prefer to do your shopping in person, Warby Parker has over 250 locations in the US and Canada, where you can get styled by one of their expert advisors. And if you need a new eyeglass prescription, well, Warby Parker has you covered there too. They offer eye exams, prescription glasses, and contacts all in one place. Eye exams start at just $85 and their eyewear starts at just $95. And that's including prescription lenses with anti-reflective and scratch-resistant coating. So Warby Parker glasses are stylish, expertly crafted with premium materials, super convenient to buy, extremely affordable, plus there's free shipping and a 30-day money-back guarantee. What are you waiting for? So head on over to warbyparker.com or use their mobile app to try their virtual try-on feature and browse their incredible selection of glasses. And right now, you can actually save 15% when you purchase 2 or more pairs of prescription glasses or sunglasses. This deal is available both online and in stores, so don't miss out. Thanks to Warby Parker for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the recap. In season 2 of You, Joe's past relationship with his ex Candace is revealed. After getting into a fight upon discovering that Candace was having an affair, Joe accidentally bludgeoned Candace's head. Thinking he'd killed her, Joe buried Candace's body and fled. But it turns out Candace wasn't dead and woke up after having been buried alive. She went to the police to have Joe arrested, but they unfortunately turned her away. And so now Candace has to get her own justice by making sure Joe's life is miserable and to stop him from ever hurting another woman. With Candace back in the picture, Joe flees New York City to hide out in Los Angeles. He locks up professional identity forger Will Bettelheim in a newly built book vault and assumes his identity. Then quickly secures himself a new apartment and a new job working in the book section of a trendy grocery store called Navrin. Proving to himself that he's a better changed man, Joe eventually releases the real Will Bettelheim from the book vault after he promises to remain quiet. Joe eventually finds a new object of his desire, Love Quinn, a recent widow from the wealthy family that owns Navrin. Unlike Beck, Love is quickly all in on her relationship with Joe right from the start, and it is Joe who is hesitant to pursue the relationship due to fearing it will lead Love to the same fate as Beck. But Joe eventually succumbs to his desires and engages in a relationship with Love. Complicating his relationship with Love is her own codependent relationship with her twin brother, 40. 40 is a recovering addict and trust fund baby who dreams of being a famous writer and director, but lacks the drive and talent necessary to succeed. Soon, Joe is roped into helping 40 write his next attempted film project, an adaptation of Guinevere Beck's book. And to make things with 40 even more complicated, Love's twin brother also begins dating a woman named Amy, who is actually Joe's ex-girlfriend, Candace. Candace gets close to Love and warns her about Joe's violent nature, but unfortunately, Love believes Joe when he claims that Candace is just a crazy, spiteful ex-girlfriend. Meanwhile, Joe also begins a friendship with his new teenage neighbor, Ellie. When Ellie lands an internship with famous comedian Henderson, Ellie's older sister Delilah confides in Joe that Henderson has a history of sexually assaulting minors, including Delilah when she was younger. And so Joe goes into vengeful protector mode, confronting Henderson about his history of abuse. This confrontation ends with Joe accidentally pushing Henderson down a flight of stairs, which kills him, leading to yet another murder for Joe to cover up. Although the police determine that Henderson's death was accidental, Delilah's cop friend with benefits, Fincher, starts looking more into the case and begins to suspect Joe. This prompts Delilah to search Joe's apartment for evidence, which in turn prompts Joe to lock Delilah up in his book vault. Joe doesn't want to kill Delilah and leave Ellie an orphan, so he plans to release her and flee the country, leaving Love behind. But when Joe goes to the book vault the next morning, he finds that Delilah has been murdered. Candace arrives and locks Joe inside, then calls Love to the scene so she can prove once and for all that Joe is a murderer. But this plan backfires on Candace as Love murders her and confesses to Joe she also killed Delilah so that Joe's secret was safe and he wouldn't need to run away without her. And then Love reveals that she also killed her and 40's au pair when they were children, and that from the beginning she was manipulating Joe to make him fall in love with her, the same way he had previously done to Beck. This shatters Joe's image of Love and he even debates killing her, but Love reveals that she's pregnant, so Joe decides to try loving Love again so he can be with his baby. And although Love can forgive Joe for his past crimes, her twin brother 40 cannot, confronting the two of them and holding Joe at gunpoint. And that's when Officer Fincher arrives, shooting and killing 40. The murders of Henderson and Candace are then pinned on 40, and the Quinn family helps to cover up the crimes. Joe then gives the newly orphaned Ellie a stack of cash and promises to continue sending money as she runs off to start a new life. Now, with all of his roadblocks and issues resolved, Joe is free to be with Love, moving into a nice suburban house together in which they could raise their baby. But finding out Love is a murderer is not something Joe can so easily move past, and he's already got his sights set on his next object of desire, his new next-door neighbor. In Season 3 of You, Joe and Love attempt to live in peaceful domestic bliss in the Madre Linda suburbs, but things quickly begin to unravel. Joe becomes obsessed with their new neighbor Natalie Engler and loses interest in his wife Love and their newborn child Henry. When Love discovers Joe's latest obsession, she murders Natalie. After helping Love dispose of Natalie's body, Joe and his wife attempt to cover up the murder while also ingratiating themselves into their new community. Joe is hired by a local librarian named Marianne to restore rare books, leading to her becoming Joe's newest obsession. When Joe discovers that Marianne's ex-husband Ryan was playing dirty to win custody of the couple's young child, Joe begins stalking him to figure out a way to help his new love. Eventually, Ryan catches Joe stalking him, forcing Joe to murder him. Meanwhile, Love opens up her own bakery and builds a new plexiglass vault in its basement. After discovering a local anti-vax man named Gil had inadvertently caused Henry to catch the measles, Love frames him for Natalie's murder. Love also befriends local mom influencer Sherry Conrad, who proposes that her and her husband Carrie enter into a swinging relationship with Love and Joe. Joe, looking for a way to end his marriage, agrees to the proposition. As Joe and Love continue their new sexual exploits with the Conrads, they accidentally expose their involvement in Natalie's murder. Joe and Love are forced to subdue the Conrads and lock them in the plexiglass vault, which the eccentric Conrads find to be arousing. As Love feels Joe pulling away to focus on his new obsession, she begins a new relationship of her own. Love meets and quickly becomes romantic with a young college student named Theo. Love soon discovers that Theo is in fact the stepson of Matthew Engler, husband of the murdered Natalie. Theo confides in Love that Matthew is skeptical that Gil is the real murderer and begins illegally surveilling the residence of Madre Linda. Although Matthew eventually gives up on his search, Theo does see video footage of Joe driving Natalie's car and races to the bakery to warn Love of her husband's crimes. At the bakery, Theo discovers the imprisoned Conrads, forcing Love to knock him out, although Joe does rescue him and bring him to the hospital. Love finally confronts Joe about his new obsession with Marianne, prompting Joe to ask for a divorce. Devastated by her husband's actions, Love paralyzes him with a drug known as aconite and then calls Marianne to their home, where she reveals to the librarian that Joe is a violent man who had murdered Ryan. After Marianne flees, Love attempts to kill her husband for his betrayal. Instead, Joe reveals that he has taken an antidote and then murders Love, frames her for all of the Madre Linda deaths, and burns their house to the ground. As the season comes to a close, Sherry and Carrie escape the vault, their marriage stronger than ever. The estranged Matthew and Theo reconcile, and Joe leaves his son Henry in the care of his co-worker Dante, before heading to Paris, France, France in search of Marianne. In Season 4 of You, Joe has successfully framed the string of Madre Linda murders on Love and faked his own death to freely stalk his latest object of desire, Marianne. When Joe tracks down Marianne and her daughter Juliet in London, Marianne is horrified and wants nothing to do with the murderous Joe. Wanting to prove he is a reformed and worthy man, Joe chooses to leave Marianne alone. Joe is then confronted by a hitman named Elliot, sent by Love's father to find and kill him. Instead, Elliot empathizes with Joe's desire to be a better man, giving him a passport with a new identity in exchange for the money Joe stole from Love's account, and for killing the only witness to Joe's current survival, Marianne. Joe can't bring himself to kill Marianne, so he instead steals her necklace to trick Elliot into thinking that she is dead. And with that, Joe is now free to live a new life in Europe as English professor Jonathan Moore. As Joe builds his new life in London, he develops feelings for Kate Galvin, the girlfriend of his obnoxious neighbor and fellow professor Malcolm Harding. At a party amongst the wealthy elites of the Sundry House, Joe meets and befriends the author Reese Montrose, Kate's socialite best friend Lady Phoebe, and Phoebe's wealthy American boyfriend Adam Pratt, who owns the Sundry House and secretly hires men to urinate on him. The next morning, Joe wakes up in a drunken haze and discovers that Malcolm has been murdered and is missing a finger. Thinking himself responsible, Joe quickly disposes of the body. But Joe is then shocked when he receives a text from the real killer, thanking him for his help and getting rid of the evidence. Joe then begins researching Malcolm in the hopes of discovering who murdered him. Amidst this investigation, a nepo baby artist with a connection to Malcolm, Simon Sue, is similarly murdered and has his ear cut off, prompting the public to dub the murderer as the Eat the Rich Killer. Later, Joe returns home to discover that the killer has broken into his apartment, taunting him with the knowledge of his real identity. As Joe continues growing closer with Kate, the pair eventually begin a relationship. Adam's bodyguard Vic grows suspicious of Joe and follows him, finding Malcolm's ring, which had been planted on Joe to further frame him. And so, Joe is forced to kill Vic. The secret killer then demands that Joe murder Kate, but he refuses. Phoebe invites Joe and Kate to a weekend getaway at her family estate, where Joe becomes disgusted by the ways that Phoebe's friends and family mistreat their staff. Phoebe confesses her fears that Adam doesn't truly love her, while Adam plots to marry Phoebe to use her family's money to pay off his growing debts. During the getaway, Phoebe's friends Gemma and Rawld both accuse Joe of being the Eat the Rich Killer, but as Joe tries to absolve himself of any guilt, he discovers that Gemma has been murdered, with Kate standing over her holding a knife. Kate professes her innocence and Joe believes her, helping her dispose of the body and theorizing that the mystery killer is now trying to frame them both. Rawld catches Joe disposing of Gemma's body and chases him through the woods with a shotgun. Joe manages to subdue Rawld but is then caught by the real killer, Reese, who came from poverty and wants to enact revenge against the wealthy elites who tried to keep him down. Reese locks up Joe and Rawld in the dungeon and demands that Joe kill Rawld to pin all of the murders on him. When Joe refuses, Reese sets the dungeon on fire and leaves both men to die. Joe rescues Rawld and escapes the dungeon, but keeps Reese's identity as the killer a secret to everyone, wanting to bring down the murderer himself. But that would be easier said than done, as Reese announces his decision to run for mayor of London. Reese then forces Joe to find a patsy to frame for all of the murders, and in doing so, Joe catches the suspicions of one of his students, Nadia, who begins investigating her professor. After successfully framing a woman named Dawn, Reese gives Joe one final task to complete, after which he will be left alone forever. Kill Kate's estranged father, Tom Lockwood, a major political donor for Reese's rival in the mayoral race. Lockwood arrives in London trying to reconcile with his daughter and convince her to take over his company, but due to her hatred for her father's corruption, Kate refuses. When Joe refuses to kill Lockwood, Reese kidnaps Marianne and threatens her life to force Joe into cooperating. As a reluctant Joe considers killing Lockwood, Kate's father secretly professes that he is aware of Joe's true identity and murderous past, and wants him to kill his political rival Reese. Thanks to Lockwood's help, Joe finds Reese and tortures him for Marianne's location. Strangely, Reese pleads his innocence and claims attempts to not even know who Joe is. Furious by this, Joe murders the mayoral candidate, only to then realize that the Reese he has been interacting with is just a figment of his imagination, inspired by reading stories about the real Reese who had a similar upbringing to Joe. Joe then remembers that he was in fact the one who had kidnapped Marianne and then suffered a psychotic break, leading to seeing visions of Reese, a manifestation of his darker impulses that goaded him into committing all of the murders. Meanwhile, the investigating Nadia discovers Joe's villainy and finds Marianne trapped in a new glass vault, promising to find a way to release Joe's newest victim. Joe keeps all of his newfound revelations to himself and continues his romance with Kate. The pair tried to convince Phoebe to not marry Adam, who is only after her money, but Phoebe refuses to listen. And so Lockwood sends hitmen to murder Adam, hoping that stopping the wedding would win his daughter's respect and agreement to take over their family company. But Kate remains bitter toward her father and refuses. As the season comes to a close, Joe becomes haunted by all of the women he has murdered before. Ultimately, he plots to free Marianne and end his cycle of violence by sacrificing himself. Instead, Joe finds Marianne has overdosed on a medication he had earlier left for her. Joe places Marianne's lifeless body in the park, staging her death as a regular overdose. But secretly, Marianne is actually alive and had plotted this ruse with Nadia to help her escape. Kate confides in Joe her hatred for her father, who has always secretly financially supported her despite their estrangement. And so Joe kills Lockwood before committing to his final plan to rid the world of his own evil desires. Joe is rescued and lives, where Kate informs him that she has inherited her father's business and covered up Joe's involvement in Reese's death at Lockwood's command. Having miraculously survived death, Joe then chooses to fully give in to his darker impulses, murdering Nadia's boyfriend Edward and framing her for the killing. In the end, Marianne moves back to Paris with her daughter Juliet, while Joe and Kate move back to New York City together, where Kate uses her new power and fortune to clear Joe's name and establish public support for him as a victim of Love Quinn's violent rampage.